All right, I'm sorry that I don't have a PowerPoint or even a handout. I usually try to have at least a list of quotations, but this talk is hot off the press, and I just didn't have time to create any accompanying material. I should also say the talk is a kind of experiment, and I don't know if it's entirely successful, but it's venturing into some areas I hadn't written about before that I've been wanting to explore. So thank you for whatever feedback you might be able to give, and thanks for your attention. So I'm going to be talking about the experience of possibility and of its absence. I've got two epigraphs. First, from a journal entry. One thought succeeds another. No sooner is it thought, and I want to write it down, than there is a new one. Hold on to it, seize it, madness, insanity. And second, that I'm juxtaposing with this from the concept of anxiety, only a prosaic stupidity will think of this as a disorder. So, the sickness unto death is one of several Kierkegaardian texts designated specifically as psychological, and in this essay I will attempt to take that designation seriously by asking what the book contributes to our understanding of human psychology. Those who investigate this aspect of Kierkegaard's work often point out that his is emphatically a philosophical or phenomenological psychology. A shared motive for such statements is evidently to distance what Kierkegaard is up to from the varieties of reductive explanation that he himself would rightly abhor. It is with this aim that I propose to offer not only a non-reductive, but I hope a specifically anti-reductive account of how the sickness unto death can enhance our appreciation of the spiritual depth of certain conditions that are eligible also for being described in psychiatric terms. I think this kind of project is especially urgent in our current intellectual climate, where even philosophical psychology is, in the name of being naturalistic, plagued by reductive portrayals, for instance, of emotions as lacking any significant intentional reference to the world, but rather being simplistically caused by nearby objects, an explanation which is better suited for capturing how fire causes a smoke alarm to beep than for doing justice to our affective experience. I hope to develop further some brief but highly suggestive remarks that Ernest Becker has made about how to explicate Part 1, Section C, Subsection A, and subsections, lowercase a and b, of the sickness unto death, where Anticlimacus deals with despair as characterized by infinitude and finitude, or by possibility and necessity. I take infinitude and possibility as parallel terms that lie at one end of a continuum on which finitude and necessity are at the opposite end. Both extremes of the spectrum are ineliminable aspects of human existence, for we are simultaneously both. Becker, I think, writes insightfully about the relations between infinitude possibility and finitude necessity, yet what he says requires some emendation. It's in this spirit that I will use his analysis as a point of reference. Here are two passages from the sickness unto death that I'd like to single out for attention, dealing with the despair that lacks possibility or infinitude. To lack infinitude is despairing narrowness. It seems to permit itself to be tricked out of itself by the others, absorbed in all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the ways of the world. Such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too hazardous to be himself, and far easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, a mass man. Just by losing himself in this way, such a man has gained an increasing capacity for going along superbly in business and social life, indeed for making a great success in the world. And from just a little bit further, bereft of imagination, as the Philistine bourgeois always is, whether alehouse keeper or prime minister, he lives within a certain trivial compendium of experiences as to how things go, what is possible, what usually happens, etc. The Philistine bourgeois mentality reassures itself with the trite and the obvious and is just as much in despair whether things go well or badly. The Philistine bourgeois mentality thinks that it controls possibility, that it has tricked this prodigious elasticity into the trap or madhouse of probability, thinks that it holds it prisoner. It leads possibility around imprisoned in the cage of probability, exhibits it, imagines itself to be the master, does not perceive that precisely thereby it has imprisoned itself in the thraldom of spiritlessness and is the most wretched of all. Depicted here is a life of quiet desperation. Ernest Becker comments that Kierkegaard, or Anticlimacus, offers these as portrait sketches of the styles of denying possibility by inauthentic human beings. They are inauthentic, he writes, in that they do not belong to themselves, are not their own person, do not act from their own center, do not see reality on its terms. This is, he adds, a perfect description of the automatic cultural man, who is confined by culture, a slave to it, who imagines that he has an identity if he pays his insurance premium or works his electric toothbrush. What is Philistinism on this account? Above all, it is triviality, the human being lulled by the daily routines of society, content with the satisfactions that it offers him. In today's world, the car, the shopping center, the 2-week summer vacation. The Philistine is protected by the limited alternatives his society offers him, and if he does not look up from his path, he can live out his life with a certain dull security. Now, this is not so much a critique of culture and its shallow values as it is an indictment of people who take refuge in the shelter of conformity as a way of tranquilizing themselves from having to face the dizziness of possibility. Accepting ready-made answers about what to think, to do, and to be, the Philistine treats his existence as if it were a problem already solved. If his neighbors happen to be regular churchgoers, then he too goes to church. If they are contented atheists, then he follows this trend instead. Either way, he fails to become a self. This, in the vocabulary of the sickness unto death, is the condition of spiritlessness. However, what is disparaged here as the most wretched of all states we could be in is only a mild form of something that can get much worse. In terms of the metaphysics of selfhood, possibility is tamed or cut down to size, placed in a cage or in a trap when we are spiritless. By heading further in this direction, we end up with the complete annihilation of possibility, which is compared by Anticlimacus to suffocating because, as he explains, without possibility a person seems unable to breathe. It is one thing to live in such a way that everything has predictable meaning, but something else altogether to find that everything has become trivial, or in other words, meaningless. Here we begin to see what might be plausible about Becker's provocative claim in The Denial of Death, that to lack all possibility is to suffer from depression, in the contemporary pathological sense of the term. As one prominent first-person account of depression remarks, when one is experiencing such consummate spiritual desolation, it's literally hard to breathe. The person who is merely spiritless would thus embody a subclinical depressive state. What enables him or her to function so capably in the everyday world is a lack of imagination as to how anything might be different than it is. He or she would never daydream, would not have racing thoughts, and would not be moved by aspirations of living differently. Yet at its extreme, this would no longer be a comfortable, though bland, life, but would lead to fatalism, in which alternative possibilities are so utterly absent that one loses a sense that anything could be, to the slightest degree, other than it is. So we read, as Anticlimacus asserts that the fatalist has no God, or what amounts to the same thing, his or her God is necessity. The brute force of things impossible ever to change would surround and stifle a person. As some depression narratives record, what makes the condition intolerable is the foreknowledge that no remedy will come. The world of someone who is depressed can be without a felt sense of the availability of anything besides the present, empty and desolate state of things. With no attractive possibilities in sight, either now or in the future, a person seems deterministically incapacitated to act freely, while the obligatory tasks of life appear overwhelmingly difficult. He goes about his business mechanically without feeling the affective pull of enticing possibilities in the world that are typically available to him in non-depressed states. It is no wonder that he is said to forget his name, divinely understood. Passionate inspiration, an awareness of one's highest potential, is missing. Yet, as Anticlimacus contends, every human being is primitively intended to be a self. So, part 2, out of 4. The experience of spiritual desolation is conveyed in Kierkegaard's writings both from a knowledgeable observer's perspective and also from within, from an experiential standpoint. We read in works of love about times when despondency wants to make everything empty for you, to transform all of life into a monotonous and meaningless repetition, so that you do indeed see all of it, but with such indifference that it seems to you as if God had withdrawn into himself, as if God were far off in heaven, infinitely far away from all this triviality that is scarcely worth living for. And likewise, in Either Or, we hear not only the judge's ideas about depression, but more importantly, the attestations of A that give voice to a depressive state of mind. My soul has lost possibility, he laments. My life is utterly meaningless. Complaining of the wretchedness of life, he writes, the only thing I see is emptiness. The only thing I live on is emptiness. The only thing I move in is emptiness. If I were offered all the glories or all the torments of the world, one would move me no more than the other. Or, my soul is so heavy, over my inner being broods an oppressiveness. How empty and meaningless life is. Everything seems vacuous and insignificant. Nothing affects him one way or another, and as a result, he feels debilitated. I feel, he writes, as a chessman must when the opponent says of it, that piece cannot be moved. A psychiatrist, I think, would not hesitate to classify A as depressed, at least in these moments. This is compatible with, and perhaps entailed by, the fact that he is suffering from a form of despair. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, although the young man in Either Or speaks about his depression, the word he actually uses is tungsin, which is perhaps more accurately rendered in English as melancholia or melancholy, as it sometimes is, although not usually, in the Princeton edition of Kierkegaard's writings. Interestingly, one depression memoir that I cited above offers a comparable argument about the term. Melancholia would still appear to be a far more apt and evocative term for the blacker forms of the disorder. This is from William Styron's Darkness Visible. But unfortunately, this term was usurped by a noun with a bland tonality and lacking any magisterial presence, used indifferently to describe an economic decline or a rut in the ground, a true wimp of a word for such a major illness. And in the context of Kierkegaard's work, there are additional grounds for doubting the accuracy of translating tungsin as depression. Most relevant of all is that because psychology as an independent discipline had not yet been established when he was alive, Kierkegaard could not have had in mind all the connotations that the term depression has acquired by now. I concede that this is true. However, the question I'm concerned about here is whether the sickness unto death can illuminate what we call depression, in colloquial speech and as a technical diagnostic term, and I believe that it can. In keeping with my anti-reductive approach, I want to maintain not that spiritual desolation or finitude's despair is merely depression, but that rather depression at its worst can be more profoundly understood as a total spiritual desolation, such as what the young man in Repetition sets forth when he moans, "I am sickened by existence. It is insipid, without salt and meaning. My mind is numb," or is it more correct to say that I am losing it? Without positing an identity between depression and despair, I think we can safely say that one form of despair tends toward depression or melancholy. According to analogies delineated in The Sickness Unto Death, we need possibility in order to breathe, so the absence of possibility might asphyxiate us. It would be like attempting to speak words composed entirely of consonants with no vowel sounds. Expressing this in even stronger language, Kierkegaard claims that someone who lacks possibility is bereft of the divine. He states, "Possibility is a hint from God. One must follow it." Depression could then be described as a state of being in which we have either missed the hint that possibility offers or somehow not been given it in the first place. In spite of how frequently the notion is invoked, sufferers and expert analysts alike have remarked on how depression remains a great mystery, about which we have more questions than answers. Kierkegaard's work can perhaps enhance our awareness of how depression is best understood, both phenomenologically in terms of what it is like, and metaphysically in the sense of how it involves an asymmetrical relation of the self to the category of the possible. The physician of the soul, we're told, knows that just as there is merely imaginary sickness, there is also merely imaginary health. We have seen, I think, that one form of imaginary health, or perhaps normotic illness, is a mode of stultifying bourgeois complacency in which one has narrowed down his or her realm of possibility and simplified the tasks of life in order to be sheltered inside a flat, unimaginative sanctuary. When one's world of possibility is even more radically muted, one suffers from a smothering feeling of meaninglessness. The mild, low-level melancholy that hums in the background of one's life when a sense of security and tranquility actually signifies being in despair is continuous with a deep and complete depression. The ontological concept of the possible, which is part of our typical experience of the world, must be invoked if we are to make sense of how a person feels when significance has gone missing from his or her life. And what allows this to qualify as a pathological condition is that it closes us off to those hints from the divine, which alone can give meaning to our finite lives. Part 3. While one form of despair involves a stifling feeling of diminished or absent possibility, another, infinitudes or possibilities despair, is defined by an overabundance of meaningful possibilities, making it exactly opposed to the first type. Rather than having mental processes slow down to the point that one is plainly impaired, the person overflowing with possibility has a quick mind, a swarm with many ideas. Yet there can be too much of an inherently good thing, as Kierkegaard, I think, indicates in the journal entry that served as my first epigraph. Citing The Sickness Unto Death on how the bourgeois Philistine thinks he has tricked possibility into a madhouse, Becker interprets this to mean that one of the great dangers of life is too much possibility, and that the place where we find people who have succumbed to this danger is the madhouse. Here is some further elucidation by Anticlimacus of what it's like to suffer from infinitude's despair, which lacks the finite. Infinitude's despair, he writes, is the fantastic, the unlimited. As a rule, imagination is the medium for the process of infinitizing, which is why it can be called the capacity instar omnium, or capacity of all capacities. It is sheer being able. The fantastic, we read in The Sickness Unto Death, is generally that which leads a person out into the infinite in such a way that it only leads him away from himself, and thereby prevents him from coming back to himself, even if it's true that the intensity of this medium is the possibility of the intensity of the self. The possible is nothing less than the form in which the eternal gets expressed within time, as we also read in works of love. However, if one's infinitizing enthusiasm is not bound tightly to the finite realm, then this expansive factor continues to inflate, as in a feverish dream. Quoting again, if possibility outruns necessity so that the self runs away from itself in possibility, it flounders around in possibility until exhausted, but neither moves from the place where it is nor arrives anywhere. For necessity is literally that place. To become oneself is literally a movement in that place. What is needed is readily enough stated. To actualize some of what is possible, it is to become concrete, so that the self's volition, once infinitized, comes back to itself in the most rigorous sense, so that when furthest away from itself, it is simultaneously and personally closest to carrying out the infinitely small part of the work that can be accomplished this very day, this very hour, this very moment. It is to live in eternity while hearing the clock strike. This means an infinite moving away from oneself in the infinitizing of the self and a coming back to oneself in the finitizing process. Yet we are told this infinitizing can so sweep a man off his feet that his state remains simply an intoxication, a state in which a person can become lost. Eventually, we read, everything seems possible, but this is exactly the point at which the abyss swallows up the self. Possibility becomes more and more intensive. The instant something appears to be possible, a new possibility appears, and finally, these phantasmagoria follow one another in such rapid succession that it seems as if everything were possible. And this is exactly the final moment, the point at which the individual himself becomes a mirage. What the self now lacks is indeed actuality, and in ordinary language too, we say that an individual has become unreal. What is missing is essentially the power to obey, to submit to the necessity in one's life, to what may be called one's limitations. As Becker comments, here the self is unanchored, unlimited, not bound enough to everyday things. It is abstract, ethereal, unreal. It billows out of the earthly categories of space and time. He remarks, adding that the words of Anticlimacus at this point are precisely clinical, in a sense to which I'll return in just a moment. First, allow me to ask, what diagnostic label might fit the following description? Legends and fairy tales tell of the knight who suddenly sees a rare bird and chases after it, because it seems at first to be very close, but it flies again. And when night comes, he finds himself separated from his companions and lost in the wilderness where he now is. So it is also with the desire's possibility. Instead of taking the possibility back into necessity, he chases after possibility and at last cannot find his way back to himself. In melancholy, the opposite takes place. So Becker's answer is that this sounds like schizophrenia, an affliction in which it is indeed true that significance appears everywhere in one's world. However, another non-ordinary condition in which we feel dizzy from an overabundance of meaning, and one that fits better with the diagnosis offered by Anticlimacus, is mania, or so I want to suggest. Becker was working years in advance of even the DSM-3, and he might have had the cyclothymic or bipolar spectrum less present to mind. Yet many of the currently accepted distinguishing features of manic and hypomanic episodes, such as flight of ideas, talkativeness, excessive planning, distractibility, and increase in goal-directed activity, could readily be viewed as various ways in which a heightened awareness of enticing possibilities might manifest itself. Even some prominent psychiatric diagnosticians, for instance, K. Redfield Jameson, admit that it is at least understandable why people who experience these so-called symptoms do not always view them as in themselves undesirable, at least when not so excessive as to be completely incapacitating. Indeed, it would be cynical and narrow-minded to rule out a religious, or if you prefer, spiritually meaningful interpretation of these phenomena. Part 4. It is peculiar that no one seems to have noticed that the sickness unto death advances what we might call a bipolar theory of being. The manic aspect of some forms of despair has been particularly little mentioned. What I would like to suggest is that we can better appreciate why we tend toward the extremes of despair defined by a lack of either infinitude or finitude if we see the categories of depression and mania as one-sided ways of relating to factors that are endemically human. The interplay of these two polarities is relevant to each form of despair because the self is composed of infinitude and finitude. From the vantage point of seeking to understand what is going on in modes of experience that are susceptible to being described in psychiatric terms, invoking the ontological notion of possibility is, I think, a promising strategy. Presently, it is infrequent at best to find possibility explicitly formulated in first or third person explanations of the manic mode of being. Yet, as we can see, there is reason to expect that the term will typically fit. Thus, the category of the possible can serve to clarify kinds of experience that often evade our grasp. A frequent theme in memoirs of mania, which are vastly outnumbered by depression memoirs, a frequent theme is the vast and fascinating range of alternatives that seem to be available to a person. As one sufferer writes, when you're manic, your mind is running so fast that you can easily envision alternate endings to any given moment. Or, I felt that I could do anything, that no task was too difficult. One subject reports feeling surrounded by ingenious minds, utopian visionaries with the ability to change the world. Another narrative reports that during mania one believes all people are geniuses if we can just reignite the infant fires within us. What makes it difficult simply to pathologize this state of mind is that all of us do have great potential, which we might access only when inspired from within. One's friends could alter the world somewhat to reflect their ideals, and so on. Thus, there is a truth in mania, just as there is arguably a truth in depression, since both states can provide a person with actual knowledge. As one expert summarizes, you have certain spiritual insights when manic. You experience enhanced empathy with the suffering of others when depressed, and others have made similar comments. A prominent feature of any Christian view is that there is an eternal significance to the life of the finite person. Another is that we are nothing but dust, and that to dust we shall return. Yet we cannot follow every hint from God, nor can we live while remaining mired exclusively in a sense of our own nothingness. Kierkegaard considers it feasible, if rare, to feel at one and the same time how great and how insignificant one is. More characteristically, these awarenesses would manifest themselves in succession within different moods. Someone who is equally both infinite and finite at once, who is in touch with the possible and the necessary at the same time, may be ideally situated to feel simultaneously his or her own greatness and insignificance. This would represent a state of spiritual well-being and existential self-awareness. Next best, perhaps, would be to achieve integration across the polarities, uniting the self over time throughout all the fluctuations of having possibility exceedingly present or else entirely absent. According to the affective psychology outlined in The Sickness Unto Death, every human being must come to terms with the possible and the finite, since these metaphysical categories are constitutive elements of our being in the world. In the non-ordinary states we have so far examined, we witness what it's like to experience a disorienting excess of either possibility or finitude. Because these categories or factors are always at issue in human existence, the extreme cases bring into sharp relief a challenge that each of us faces. Due to the very structure of the human psyche, we are burdened with the task of being both ethereal and mundane simultaneously. Yet what unifies such traits as having racing thoughts or flight of ideas, being talkative, making plans and pursuing ambitious projects, and having one's attention easily captured by an even more captivating object, is that all of these involve a keen sense of possibility. Bringing this term into the context of psychiatric theory and practice might therefore aid our understanding of what otherwise presents itself as simply a list of miscellaneous symptoms. And since possibility is a non-natural axiological concept, making use of it also helps us in the pursuit of an anti-reductive explanation. Pursuing the anti-reductive project further, we might try to identify the ground of selfhood, that through which the self is related to alluring possibilities. Now, developing this idea in greater detail would require a separate paper, but for now, let me say it briefly. Assuming that Kierkegaard is a monotheist, we can formulate a simple syllogism. First, the self that has overcome despair rests transparently in God. Second, God is love, or in other words, love alone is the substantive term that describes God. Third, by entailment, the self is grounded in love. This divine self-grounding power, which forms the heart by flowing from the heart, attaches us to the surrounding world of others, of places and things, pursuits and causes. The God of love, you who are love, as Kierkegaard writes, is the source of all love, by virtue of which possibility dawns in the midst of contingent finitude, and the divine inhabits the finite and finds its way in it, as he writes in a journal entry. Nothing less than this is at stake in the enterprise of becoming oneself, and we can read in these words the evocation of an ideal to be striven toward. A Kierkegaardian psychology can do justice to the tension at the heart of human existence, that we are unbounded, inspired by the divine, and yet, at the same time, entirely finite. Thank you.
I'll just make a brief introduction of myself. My name is Christian Lundsgaard-Leth. I'm from the University of Aalborg. I live in Copenhagen, but and even though Denmark is a small country, Aalborg is as far away as you can get, at least in terms of academic institutions. So I do commute quite a bit. But now I'm here and I'll go straight to business. Well, I'd also like to apologize, I guess, before actually starting, that I also didn't print out a handout, and I didn't make it either, and I didn't do a PowerPoint presentation or anything. And it is also quite sketchy, both because it's a work in progress and because I'm gonna cover in a way too much material. But let's see what you have to say about that. Here's what I have to say about that. There's a confusing equivocality to the concept of possibility in Kierkegaard's authorship. The very meaning of the concept thus seems to undergo a curious transformation with every changing perspective of the many Kierkegaardian pseudonyms. Most interpreters are of course well aware that the modal terms of actuality, possibility, and necessity play a crucial role to Kierkegaard, but it is rarely attempted to say something more systematic about how and why these concepts are used in such different ways throughout the authorship. To sketch at least the outlines, the sketchy outlines of such an account is what I will try to do here. I will allow myself to disregard almost Kierkegaard's entire non-pseudonymous authorship, with the sole exception of works of love, just as I will allow myself to focus exclusively on texts that were written between 1843 and 1849. I believe, I postulate Kierkegaard to have developed a coherent and mature theory of existence within this 6-year span. Somewhat regrettably, I have not found the time and space to integrate neither either-or, repetition, or stages on life's way into this brief account. Probably that's lucky that I didn't. But I will neither try to justify nor elaborate on this exclusion at present. It is conspicuous how the Kierkegaardian pseudonyms appeared to become increasingly interested in considering and applying the category of possibility throughout the publications of the 1840s. In Fear and Trembling, thus, the concept of possibility is used a mere 4 times in total, whereas the Silentio refers to impossibility a combined 11 times. In Philosophical Crumbs, the two concepts are utilized a combined 26 times, with a palpable 17 of these conspicuously appearing in the infamous interlude. In the concept of anxiety from 1844, possibility finally seems to have become a regular cornerstone concept, so to speak. In this book, the concept of possibility and impossibility thus turn up on no less than 81 different occasions. In the concluding Unscientific Postscript from 1846, that tendency continues insofar as the concepts are employed a record 172 times in total. Although we are down, quote unquote, to 147 and 115 instances of application of the two terms in the works of Love from 1847 and the Sickness unto Death from 1849, these works still represent an actual peak in the pseudonymous interest in the concepts of possibility and impossibility. This is the case for the very simple reason that both of these works are simply much shorter books than the quantitatively bulky postscript. All that being said, the purely arithmetical exercise of exhibiting where the concept of possibility is used how often is admittedly neither very philosophically interesting nor very explanatorily enlightening. Allow me therefore to jump straight into Fear and Trembling and begin a more substantial investigation of the evolution of possibility in Kierkegaard's thought. In Fear and Trembling, we ultimately do not learn much positive about the book's real message. Instead, we learn something negative about which kind of philosophical question will not allow us to make sense of the figure of the venerable Father Abraham, the book's protagonist. As anyone vaguely familiar with the Old Testament and Kierkegaard will know, Abraham is willing to sacrifice his only child, Isaac, to prove his faith in as well as his faithfulness to God. Abraham never actually sacrifices Isaac, but he is seemingly fully willing to do so. And the true greatness as well as the undeniable appallingness of his faith consists precisely in his calm willingness to follow through. The way I see it, Fear and Trembling primarily has a negative lesson to teach, namely the following. It is utterly impossible to make sense of Abraham's faith inside the scope of the ethical sphere. In the ethical sphere, which we can allow ourselves to identify more or less with Hegelian ethical life or Sittlichkeit, we act due to reasons that can become, potentially at least, recognized by other rational agents. To be able to become recognized by others, ethical deeds must abide by norms that are also, at least potentially, understandable to everyone else. There can, of course, be intelligible ethical conflicts. For instance, and I think paradigmatically, the tragic dilemma between mourning dead loved ones in an appropriate manner and protecting the city-state that we encounter in Antigone famously. Indeed, there always will be a lot of such conflicts. Such conflicts are still, however, intelligible conflicts internal to the ethical sphere. Regarding the problem of personal identity, these considerations also have a huge significance. According to the Hegelian model, ethical life, thus, I cannot become who I am in splendid isolation. Rather, I must necessarily transform my internal emotions into external actions, since I can only understand myself as being in a certain way if others recognize that I am in fact acting in accordance with this way of being. Regarding the problem of personal identity, here we should ask ourselves whether Hegelianism is not philosophically right to suggest that it does not make any sense to speak about any constitution of subjectivity outside of the domain of normative processes of recognition that we call the ethical sphere. Furthermore, does this not imply that we can only make sense of any possible action if we manage to make sense of ourselves to others, who can then go on to recognize or refuse to recognize the reasons we present? I believe we have strong reasons to take these Hegelian claims seriously, and de Silentio does indeed take them very seriously. As such, he insists that it is utterly impossible for anyone who does not have faith to understand how we could ever be able to justify Abraham. We do learn that Abraham's faith somehow enables him to exist as this particular individual in an exclusive God relation, which allegedly somehow transcends all social relations. And we also learn that we must somehow be able to consider infanticide as a holy deed. But we never actually learn what is really implied in these proclamations, other than the fact that they are both utterly incomprehensible, not to mention absurdly appalling to ethical reasoning, which indeed they are. More must be said, but I do claim, and I repeat, the claim that the primary lesson of fear and trembling is the following one. However faith might be characterized in positive terms, we still do not know how. It is impossible to understand from the point of view of the standard philosophical framework of Hegelianism, which at Kierkegaard's time was, and still very much is, the standard point of view of a lot of highly persuasive social philosophy. Allow me to move on. In the interlude of the philosophical crumbs, or however we want to translate smulerne, we learn a bit more about why we could have some actual reasons to be skeptical towards Hegelian ontology. Interestingly, Climacus coins this critique in a terminology permeated by the modal distinctions between actuality, possibility, and necessity. The fundamental claim of Climacus is that it is ultimately completely ontologically unacceptable to conflate the logical concepts of necessity with the historical concepts of actuality and possibility. Climacus poses the following rhetorical question. Has the possible, by having become actual, become more necessary than it was? And clearly answers it with a resounding no, it hasn't. To Climacus, necessity has nothing to do whatsoever with historical realities. In history, the transition from the past to the now is simply a possible transition from one state to another, in which one option, rather than other possible ones, becomes actualized. By having become actualized, however, it does not become necessary after the fact that it became actualized. It simply became the actual case that whatever happened actually became the case, i.e. that it happened. And metaphysical necessity has nothing at all to do with any of it. Importantly, the possibility-actuality dialectics of real historical life becomes radicalized, doubly potentiated, I believe Climacus calls it, when it comes to the self-reflective choices of and actions of human beings. Human beings, thus, are not only exposed to non-necessary instances of becoming in natural history, such as, for instance, the transition from an acorn to an oak tree, they are also able to act freely, i.e. to choose to do one thing rather than another. Since Hegel claims that the philosophical understanding of what has taken place is effectively a way of realizing the necessity of the historical processes, Climacus is certainly criticizing Hegelianism here. The actual Hegel, I claim, however, is not suggesting that historical and not logical necessity amount to one and the same thing. It's just a wrong reading of Hegel, and it's a bad reading of Hegel. He's also not arguing, that's Hegel, that history could not have turned out in any other way, merely because he terminologically refers to the dialectical patterns of historical development as necessities, quote unquote, that philosophy can grab after they have happened. So is this disagreement between Hegel and Climacus then a mere terminological one? And if it is, have we yet learned anything positive about the Kierkegaardian project other than the fact that it cannot be conflated with neither Hegelian ethical life nor with Hegelian metaphysics, as the Kierkegaardian pseudonyms understand those things? Not really, I think. So let us move on to the concept of anxiety. I know I'm moving very quickly, but I mean, that's the only way I'll do this in half an hour. In the concept of anxiety, the concept of possibility and actuality are applied in a manner that is quite distinct from the appalling faith terminology from Fear and Trembling on the one hand, as well as the very formal ontology terminology from the Crumbs on the other hand. More specifically, Hoffniensis existentializes the concepts by zeroing in on the way in which each individual human being is spiritually awoken from the dreaming state of childhood in an anxious realization of freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility, frihedens virkelighed som mulighed for muligheden, as the famous passage goes. In the concept of anxiety, thus, the concept of possibility is specifically meant to imply an experiential rather than a merely logical category. When we experience that we have possibilities to act in a way that other animals do not, thus this experience firstly feels in a certain way, i.e. it begets anxiety. Secondly, it totally restructures how we might understand our life, how we must understand our lives. As such, we cannot experience the possibility of freedom, frihedens virkelighed som mulighed for muligheden, without also experiencing that this very possibility makes it necessary for us to take responsibility for how we act with this freedom once we actually start to act. To put the same point differently, the very experience of the spiritual fact that we are free forces us to make sense of our life through normative concepts of how we ought to act, and this realization is anxiety-inducing. To be sure, the concept of anxiety also focuses a lot on the possibility and actuality of the theological concept of sin. Very briefly put, sin is the qualitative transition that breaks with the ethically ignorant innocence of childhood by the quote-unquote evil deed of an individual, which is not necessary. For this reason, the forms of anxiety connected with sinful existence are no longer just dreamily concerned with the mere possibility of sinful action, but with possible approaches to having become a sinner. The qualitative act of sinning itself, however, cannot really be described by the psychological approach of Vigilius Hoffniensis, who therefore limits himself to talking about states of mind such as uncommunicative, enclosing reserve, indesluttethed, or the lack of earnestness that both increase our propensity to sin but aren't really sinning. The concept of anxiety is stuffed with remarkably acute psychological and existential insights, but it nonetheless remains very unclear what actual sinning amounts to. It also remains rather unclear what we are to understand by the claim in the final chapter of the book that anxiety can be saving through faith. Allegedly, this has to do with the fact that he who is educated by possibility is educated according to his infinitude, which for its part consumes all finite ends and discover all their deceptiveness. Wherefore possibility is said to be the weightiest of all categories. But again, what have we actually learned hereby, besides the claim that the standards of finite ethical life are ill-equipped to measure, so to speak, the message that Hoffniensis is here to present? We already knew this to be the case, I might add, from Fear and Trembling. We might do better having a look at the concluding Unscientific Postscript, in which Climacus returns with a vengeance to tell us a little more about the problem he posed in the Crumbs. Can there be a historical point of departure for an eternal consciousness? Climacus insists that he only seeks to dress up this problem in its historical costume, but it quickly becomes evident that this new approach requires him to shift from the highly speculative terminology of the interlude to an approach much closer to the more existential lingo of the concept of anxiety. In the postscript, we are forcefully assured that actuality is both existentially and ethically higher than possibility all of a sudden. Here, possibility clearly no longer indicates the infinitely educating possibility of faith from the concept of anxiety, which was said to be saving. Instead, it designates the either way too abstract possibilities of metaphysical thinking or the way too disengaged possibilities of aesthetical existence. Importantly, the truly ethical in the postscript is no longer thought of as the kind of agency which takes place inside the space of normative reasoning in Hegel's ethical life. Instead, the true ethical stance, the way I read the postscript, is now modeled on the iconic figure of Socrates, whose passionate inwardness and insistence on personal appropriation, rather than the blind acceptance of society's norms, Climacus praises in no uncertain terms. The paradoxality of Socratic existence in all its ethical actuality, however, will only take us so far. The paradox between the infinite passion of Socrates for the good, on the one hand, and the temporal conditions of human existence on the other, thus does not represent the highest kind of ethical actuality that we are presented to in the postscript. This prize goes instead to Christian religiousness rather, in which the paradox becomes internal to the truth itself, insofar as this very truth, i.e. the incarnation of Christ, at least it's the most obvious way to look at it, is a conceptually impossible fusion of eternity and finitude. All things considered, the postscript tells us much more about the general existential predicament of human, about the true Socratic nature of ethical actuality, and about the nature of Christian faith that we could ever learn from fear and trembling, let alone from the crumbs. He also couples the ontological paradox approach from the crumbs and transforms it into a far more experiential approach, much closer to Vigilius Hoffniensis' approach in the concept of anxiety. But still, what are we to understand by the faith that we now know is utterly non-Hegelian, potentially saving through possibility, and doubly paradoxical in an existential and not merely an ontological sense of the term? On the interpretation I suggest here, Kierkegaard presents a two-sided answer to this question. In the non-pseudonymous works of love from 1847, as well as in The Sickness Unto Death from 1849. I will begin my conclusion unchronologically with The Sickness Unto Death. In The Sickness Unto Death, we are given a somewhat more substantial account of Kierkegaard's theory of existence. And as we are getting used to by now, the modal terminology of possibility and actuality and necessity is once more employed in a crucial manner. Anticlimacus presents a series of investigations into the phenomenon of despair, unsurprisingly to everyone here. Despair is meant to encompass the vast range of phenomenologically distinct ways in which we can misconduct our lives as free existing individuals. And just as in the Schelling-inspired psychology of the concept of anxiety, it is clear here that a spiritually healthy self is somehow dependent on being able to perform a delicate and, insofar as possible, harmonious balancing between the polar opposite aspects that constitute selfhood. The formula for non-despair, importantly, although we are virtually also told that there is no self to be found who is entirely undespairing, is for the self to be, as we've already learned, grounded transparently in the power that established it. Anticlimacus specifies that the self is, among other things, a synthesis between freedom and necessity, and it becomes obvious that this, once again, I guess unsurprisingly at this point, hinges on a modal analysis when he goes on to address both necessities and possibilities despair as two vital forms of this disease. And of course this disease is despair. In his description of possibilities despair, Anticlimacus clarifies that the possibility despairing self, as he puts it, quote, exhausts itself floundering about impossibility, yet it never moves from where it is nor gets anywhere, for necessity is just that where. Becoming is a moment from some place, but becoming oneself is a moment at that place, unquote. This is crucial, but how and why precisely? Well, we know that the self has been established by a power different from itself, and also that non-despairing somehow amounts to being grounded transparently in this power. This power, however, which clearly represents the necessary where that ought to restrict the extent to which the self allows itself to get lost in the pure possibilities of abstract thinking, as well as in the unrestricted possibilities of romantic fantasizing, cannot be a self-limitation that stems from the Hegelian norms of recognition in the ethical sphere, I claim. To allow oneself to be constituted by the opinion of others, i.e., by the intelligible norms of social recognition, is thus precisely the predominant version of necessity's despair. What must instead be the case for Anticlimacus' position to make sense is for the self to have been somehow constituted in a way it cannot simply choose not to be, but that it can of course always relate to being. This vital feature of selfhood can neither come down to an essential genetic nature, that would be flat-out fatalism, which Anticlimacus explicitly refutes, nor can it be the outcome of social processes of recognition, a la Hegelianism. We do have a nature, of course, a genetic setup, just as we are largely shaped by the socio-cultural processes in which we find ourselves. We can also make actual choices that make a difference, both personally and politically. We are not, however, necessitated products of social processes, as Hegel would have it, just as we cannot create ourselves ex nihilo in order to become who we would like ourselves to be by choosing the most attractive possible version of ourselves that we can fantasize about, as somebody like Sartre would later have it. Instead, we always already have an individual self established by some other power than itself. This self can participate in the social game of giving and taking intelligible reasons. Indeed, it must do so. But it can also have personal reasons to do something other than the ones that would be socially recognizable, simply because he or she happens to be who he or she happens to be, and importantly, for no other social reason. This might be inexplicable from the point of view of social reasoning, but that is the whole point of having personal reasons that are irreducible to the outcomes of social processes of recognition. Crucially, this also explains how a human being can in fact be completely recognized by other persons. I consider this to be a valid existential possibility, and still suffer from despair. Maybe I should repeat that line. This also explains how a human being can in fact be completely recognized by other persons and still suffer from despair. If Honneth is right, then if we're recognized by loving family members, by the civil society in which we work and do something, and as subjects of right in a more or less just state, then there's just no way you're gonna despair. And you can despair, although all of that is the case. I claim Kierkegaard to claim. I'll get quickly back to this, so I'll finish more or less within the time frame. Bourgeois society, as Anticlimacus does not tire from accentuating, does not only provide the necessary intersubjective framework in which we can become who we are, tragically, it can also distract us as singular individuals from becoming who we are. Accepting the person we happen to be is oftentimes hard. Maybe we are less perfect than we would like to be, aesthetically as well as ethically. Maybe we are not loved in return by the ones we happen to love, or maybe we have suddenly stopped loving, for instance, the mothers and fathers of our children that we actually would very much prefer to just continue loving. We simply cannot entirely control our own selves or what we will. The will is not within the control of itself. We can will things that we would prefer not to will. We can nonetheless always find hope in the faith that for God everything is possible, although any such hope to be intelligible, must always begin with grounding oneself transparently in the actual self that one has been given. We are now able to reinterpret the previous pseudonymous text in the following way. Faith is not about validating infanticide, but about addressing a kind of normativity which transcends ethical life. Faith is not about outcompeting an ontology of necessity with an alternative ontology of actuality and possibility, but about existential actuality that transcends any kind of philosophical system. Faith is also not about having faith in any undetermined possibility whatsoever, but about having faith in hopeful possibilities for one's own given self. And faith is not about placing epistemological trust in the paradoxical nature of an external event that happened 2 millennia ago, but about having a self which is in itself paradoxically structured to the extent that it has reasons to act that it cannot argue for inside the space of social reasons of the ethical sphere. But what about everyone else's self? And this is a lot like how you ended, I think. Should we not care about other existing human beings and their struggles to be and become themselves? This question is addressed the way I see it by Kierkegaard himself in the Works of Love. Works of Love is a series of deliberations about neighborly love. The concept of neighbor, to put it with Kierkegaard, quote, really means duplicating of one's own self. Neighbor is what philosophers would call the other. It actually says tænkerne in the original, but let's just say philosophers. As far as thought is concerned, the neighbor or other need not even exist. To be sure, neighbor is in itself manifold, for neighbor means all men, and yet in another sense, one person is enough, unquote. To love the neighbor evidently makes something visible in the other that neither abstract thinking nor social reasonableness enables us to see. But what does a loving relation to the other imply, to the other self? First and foremost, loving deeds are about helping the other to love God. To love God, importantly, is also, in fact, to love oneself in truth. And this is a direct quote from Works of Love. Insofar as which we already know from the sickness unto death, or as I might, even more precisely, as we learn 2 years later in the sickness unto death. God is in fact the power that has established each self, a power furthermore in which a non-despairing self must be transparently grounded. Loving deeds, as we now realized, are ultimately a helpful attempt to assist this attempting grounding of the other self. Kierkegaard also states in the Works of Love that love is the opposite of despairingly hoping nothing at all. Love's hopefulness, in modal as well as in normative terms, hopes for the possibility of the good for oneself as well as for others, which for its part is nothing but the lover's very relationship to other men. Hoping for them, he infinitely keeps possibility open with infinite partiality for the possibility of the good, in Kierkegaard's own words. Something very important is revealed here, the way I see it. It is not enough to hope for the possibility of everything in the totally unqualified sense that for God everything is possible. Literally speaking, this is not good enough. In other words, it's not normatively enough with regards to the self of another self. More to the point, thus, we must hope for the possibility for the good, not only for ourselves, but also for others. The other, importantly, is namely also a self who has not established herself, but who is nonetheless also not a mere product of processes of social recognition. A loving relationship to the actual otherness of the other self, therefore, must be such that the other is emancipated in a twofold fashion. Both from the bourgeois worry about who the rest of society, including myself, prefers her to be or prefers her to become, and secondly, from the romantic and later existentialist fantasy that it is merely up to her who she is. Weirdly, love hereby also turns out to be an interpersonal relation that is specifically designed to free the loved one from the norms of intersubjective relations, and instead allow the neighbor to be neither this or that, but to be herself, and this everyone can be if she wills it, hopefully.
So you all know who I am already. So I'm speaking today about Kierkegaard's Poetics of the Possible. This is part of a project I'm working on, thinking about possibility within Kierkegaard and Poetics. Largely what I'm presenting here today is sort of crumbs of things that I've been thinking about and written about in other contexts. But I'd be curious to hear kind of what this basic framework makes you think about in terms of Kierkegaard's styles in relation to the possible. So Kierkegaard's known for his critique of the system, a term that targets Hegelian idealism and the speculative tradition more broadly, in its tendency to level the difference between thought and existence, the difference that Kierkegaard everywhere emphasizes. Johannes Climacus asks, from what does pure thinking abstract? From existence, consequently from what it is supposed to explain. It's clear from Climacus's discussion of, quote, existence communication, that imposing a conceptual structure on existence leaves out precisely how it is to be in a world. The movement of abstraction is precisely to think oneself out of subjectivity and out of time, and so out of possibility. Moreover, the relational structure of human existence, as Kierkegaard sees it, between finitude and infinitude, is sort of papered over in certain kinds of philosophical writing. So, as the self-proclaimed poet of existence, Kierkegaard is uniquely concerned with the role of presentation in an account of what it is to exist. Very much like the early German Romantics, style for Kierkegaard is integral to the task of philosophy itself, and he sets out to, in Climacus's terms, from fragments, combat the system, quote, by means of form, end quote, devising forms of communication that will reproduce the open-ended and dialectical structure of existence, and reinforce the importance of the existing subject as the site of truth. So I want to focus on an idea of communication that Climacus offers in Postscript, of a production in the form of possibility. So when a work is concerned with what it is to exist, and specifically with the ethical position of the existing subject, Climacus argues that the form of the communication itself must have the structure of possibility. I'll suggest how some of Kierkegaard's works might be read through this lens. Possibility is, for Kierkegaard, a feature of temporal existence or becoming. A part of his task as a writer is to actively engage his audience's sense of the anxiety or the uncanniness of becoming, since one is never fully present, fully at home. This is a feature of time itself. In time, I'm never identical to myself, says Kierkegaard. As long as one stands in the middle of things rather than at the end, the significance of life is always being worked out. But for Kierkegaard, there's the added dimension that to be an existing self is to hold in dialectical tension this dimension of finitude and infinitude. Doubt, despair, irony, anxiety, the moods most familiar in Kierkegaard's texts, involve a recognition of this uncanny feature of the human, a premonition that human existence is not merely finite, but contains the possibility of the infinite or unconditioned. These observations suggest the high stakes of a poetics of existence, or a poetics of the possible. So before we look at some poetic strategies, just as a way in, I want to look at kind of a particular modeling of the existing self and self-transformation in Kierkegaard's writings. So in Either Or, when he takes up this figure of the seducer, Don Giovanni, Faust, Johannes, he becomes quite interested in what happens to the women who have been seduced and left behind. And he spends quite a lot of time kind of thinking through what it's like to be spurned or be the subject of seduction. So the women who've been cast aside, have been humiliated. Marie Beaumarchais is Clavido's lover, Donna Vera from Don Giovanni, and Margareta from Faust. The deep interest that Kierkegaard shows in the inner life of a young girl rebuffed is sparked by the sense that to be in such a position is to have been confronted, if only as yet in a glimpse, with a new horizon that would entail being in the world in a different way. In the case of the spurned woman, it's the awakening of a new self-consciousness and a deeper inwardness, a more direct and active sense of themselves as subjects of eternal significance. He writes, "Should we interrupt them in this, their sorrow? Should we wish for them the return of what was lost? Would that be an advantage for them? Have they not already received a higher initiation?" With Cordelia, Johannes's lover, and this is always to be a really interesting part of the text when we hear from her, Kierkegaard likens this initiation to a traditionally masculine self-awareness. So Cordelia has this line like, if I were a man or something. So while the occasion for her awakening is being rejected by another, this break brings to light her own desire, her own will, and the capacity that these women have for making meaning out of their existence rather than just relying on that meaning from coming from outside. So the innocence is gone, but gets replaced by this reflective anxiety. That's a sort of more authentic recognition of what it is to exist. And there's a really great example of this dynamic if you know Henry James's novel, The Wings of the Dove. The character Millie Teal, who's this rich American heiress, she becomes aware that she's going to die, so she's sort of facing her own imminent mortality, whilst also facing the knowledge that the man she loves has been engaged to her best friend all the while, and they've been plotting to get her money from her. And this is what James writes of this situation. "The beauty of the bloom had gone from the small old sense of safety. That was distinct. She had left it behind forever. But the beauty of the idea of a great adventure, a big dim experiment or struggle in which she might more responsibly than ever take a hand, had been offered her instead." So this movement from the small old sense of safety to a position of anxiety in which Millie is also active and responsible seems to me analogous to Kierkegaard's descriptions of the shifting consciousness of rejected women in either or. Kierkegaard would perhaps go further. Hoffniensis certainly does in saying that innocence itself conceals an anxiety, which is why the transition of these women to explicit anxiety is a, quote, a higher initiation. So Kierkegaard's interest in how one's horizon can radically shift, of the way in which possibility is built into the structure of selfhood, motivates his treatment of the pseudonymous characters as well, I want to say. So his multiple authors are each rich with insight, but none claims any final authority. Being always within the perspective of a certain character and seeing divergent characters across the different works, Kierkegaard raises the question of how we come to see the world under a certain aspect, as well as how we might learn to see in a new way. Each of Kierkegaard's pseudonyms speaks in the first person, enacting Kierkegaard's commitment to, quote, placing eyes in the middle of life, he says in the journals, because it's completely lacking in our age for someone to say I. And yet it would be a mistake to read the pseudonyms as embodiments of stable identities or fixed ways of life, the aesthetic, the ethical, religious. Rather, in every case, Kierkegaard uses the pseudonyms to explore a certain kind of movement, the possibility of becoming other than what one is, which is a live possibility for the subject as subject. Indeed, this is a defining marker of what Kierkegaard calls the existing subject. So, as an author, Kierkegaard seeks various strategies to kind of heighten rather than level out the sense of self as possibility. And one can characterize this rhetorical strategy as sort of plunging the reader into the tension of temporal life or becoming, in which the self is dialectical and unfinished. So primarily I'll limit myself to talking about how Kierkegaard's use of conflicting perspectives, both within and across the works, affects this aim. And I'll also look at fear and trembling as a kind of special case. So in the pseudonymous texts, the dialectical movements within each text to strain the boundaries of how each pseudonymous author or each character within the works understands himself. As the characters end up revealing the limitations of their own perspective, I want to claim that the reader is offered a kind of model for or a space for their own transformative self-reflection. So, although it's not a pseudonymous work, you can actually see this in this kind of strategy in Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard's thesis. So, in that work, the text on irony is sort of performing its subject matter using ironic writing strategies throughout. But through the disjunctive character of irony, which always, as a rhetorical device, suggests the inadequacy of any particular perspective by opening up another frame, the text opens up another way to us, something other than irony, but one that doesn't spell out. It isn't fulfilled in the thesis itself, because that would presuppose that one already occupied a standpoint outside that of the ironist. So like John the Baptist, to whom Kierkegaard compares Socrates in irony, he says, quote, he was not the one who should come, did not have a knowledge of what would come, and yet he destroyed Judaism. He destroyed it not with the new, but through itself. He allowed Judaism to endure, and at the same time develop the seeds of its own dissolution inherent within it. So in irony, Kierkegaard kind of shows us the failure of irony as a lived standpoint, or suggests its limitations in his sort of critique of ironic freedom as being perhaps an excess of a sense of possibility and a deficiency of necessity. In this way, he allows irony to self-destruct and opens up the possibility of a higher way. Does Kierkegaard's ironic discourse finally lead us, like John the Baptist, to Christ? Is irony the negative way to the religious self? The last word of the final chapter of irony opens up the question of irony's relationship to the distinctly Christian category of humor, of course with the caveat that, quote, all this lies outside the limits of this investigation. So this opening up of further perspectives by allowing the seeds of dissolution inherent within a particular perspective to take root can be seen in a number of Kierkegaard's works. One of the most, so now I'll discuss either or. So one of the most distinctive features of Kierkegaard's style is the division of his texts into numerous sections that approach a problem from either a different philosophical or a different rhetorical angle and break with what came before, sometimes in the form of an explicit retraction. So this is an example of irony in the romantic or the literary sense of the term. Deman defines this as the interruption of discourse by a shift in rhetorical register. This is actually Deman's definition of permanent irony, or parabasis, which is a term from Friedrich Schlegel. So either or exploits this disjunctive mode of presentation to great effect. The work offers no fewer than 9 autonomous texts in the either half of the work alone, from the aesthetically minded author known only as A, or the young man. There are thematic essays on boredom, on chance, on Don Giovanni, etc., etc. Also included in this half of the work is a series of letters and journal entries from a second character, Johannes, and his lover, Cordelia. Like the young man, Johannes embodies the aesthetic life, but in a more calculated form of a seducer, for whom actuality and flesh and blood women are valued only as material for aesthetic contemplation. The or half of the work presents a defense of marriage and of the ethical life from Judge Wilhelm, in response to the young man of the first half of the work. And the last subdivision of Or is a sermon written by an unnamed pastor friend of the judge, which introduces a religious perspective into the work that departs from both the perspectives we've seen before. And then finally, the whole work is framed in the introduction by the editor, Victor Aramita, who claims to have found all the papers assembled in the drawer of an antique desk. This is a classic epistolary technique here. And he offers his own interpretation of the good life in tune with the judge. Kierkegaard then includes an additional frame narrative of the work, in that A accidentally discovers and decides to publish the diary of his friend Johannes. The excessive multiplication of frames gives the reader a heightened awareness of points of view, without providing any direction for how to navigate or resolve the perspectives. This is not to say that we don't, as readers, try to do that, but that there's sort of no objective criterion in the text for doing that. The effect is to reproduce the tension of lived experience and provide a fictional space within which to essay different points of view. So he's approaching very much a kind of literary framework here, in which we have also in a novel this same kind of essaying can go on. Climacus comments on the form of either or, that there is no conclusion and no final decision is an indirect expression for truth as inwardness, and in this way perhaps a polemic against truth as knowledge. So in this case, the inward work of appropriation is left to the reader. So Kierkegaard leaves his works, many of his works, Sudan's works in particular, without a final conclusion or decision, by employing multiple frames. But a perspective can also be shown to, quote, sow the seeds of its own dissolution in its dialectical relationship to other perspectives, so that even an obviously erroneous perspective can be instructive as a kind of negative strategy. So if we go back to either or then, Aramita's preface provides an additional reflective point of view on the essays, in which he wholeheartedly agrees with Judge Wilhelm and recommends to readers that they get married, basically. So he offers what those familiar with Kierkegaard's other works, or those alive to the irony in the text, will recognize as a bad reading, wholeheartedly endorsing the judge's ethical perspective and recommending that subsequent readers follow his advice and get married. The irony in the text entails leaving open a possibility for the naive reader to think the work of interpretation has already been carried out by the editor. For the reflective reader, this device opens up a gap of understanding that can be overcome only by the reader's active involvement in the construction of textual meaning. So this functions much like an unreliable narrator in a novel, which kind of activates the reader, because in such a case with an unreliable narrative, the reader can't sort of remain passive. You have to enter into this active role of determining textual meaning in negotiation with the narrator, who can't be relied on as an authority. So Aramita's reading, dialectically qualified by the numerous other points of view presented in the work, can thus function as a kind of via negativa that leads readers to a higher perspective, not elaborated within the bounds of the text itself. This strategy is in fact characteristic of Kierkegaard's pseudonymous works, all of which involve degrees of error as part of what Climacus deems a, quote, continual striving toward the truth. Waiting on time. So Fear and Trembling follows a similar negative strategy. So presenting the limited perspective of De Silencio, or the man he describes, who admits being unable to understand Abraham. So although the text fails in its stated aim of making faith comprehensible to thought, it does so in a way that can potentially bring the reader closer to faith, even if getting closer to faith takes the form of acknowledging that one doesn't understand or doesn't feel capable of the leap. Likewise, in Repetition, Constantine Constantius tries and fails to achieve repetition in attempting to recreate a trip to Berlin he took years earlier. Though neither of the two main characters in the narrative fully grasps what's at stake in Repetition, which is ultimately Christian and not an aesthetic category. Their attempts put the movement into relief by showing what it is not. It's not irony, it's not recollection, it's not mediation, it's not hope, etc. So we have a multiplicity of undecidable perspectives that aren't adjudicated from any kind of objective position. Also, the suggestion that perspectives that get things wrong can open up frames beyond the text. Fear and Trembling is the text I want to talk about next. So Kierkegaard uses other poetic strategies to reorient the vision of readers so that they might see themselves anew, stripped of the usual pretensions and assurances about how things go, what one does, what is likely to happen, the familiar hallmarks of the bourgeois Philistine in sickness. So Fear and Trembling, of course, puts readers squarely in the middle of an agonizing choice. The author turns to the subject of Abraham as the father of faith, trying and failing to make the movement of faith comprehensible. And De Silencio's initial kind of Socratic admission that he's incapable of understanding Abraham offers readers an opportunity to likewise suspend or at least reevaluate what they think they know about one of the central figures in Judeo-Christian history. De Silencio's rhetorical position thus actively encourages doubt and even anxiety, inviting readers to join the author in admitting to themselves their inability to understand the matter of faith. To reinforce this aim of suspension or questioning, De Silencio offers readers a familiar story in an unfamiliar form, playing this game of stranger that Eben was talking about earlier. The attunement section that opens the book presents imaginative versions of the Abraham and Isaac story, each emphasizing a different aspect of the narrative and how the different characters in the story understand what unfolds. So in one, you all know it, in one moving version, Isaac sees the knife tremble in Abraham's hand, and he's unable to ever have faith again. In another, Abraham goes through the motions of faith, offering up Isaac, but in his soul he becomes old and loses his taste for life as a result of the strain of God's trial. The immediate tension of the choice facing Abraham, and Isaac as well, is maintained in these imaginative readings. The reader is unable to take comfort in the knowledge that everything works out in the end, or the platitude that Abraham is the father of faith. The question is, what does that even mean? As Kierkegaard writes in the journals, philosophy is perfectly right in saying that life must be understood backwards, but then one forgets the other clause, that it must be lived forwards. So Abraham's trial confronts us as our own. The choice of how to live has no external criteria. In this way, and I'm applying Climacus's words here to Fear and Trembling, as Climacus describes in the postscript, the reader is brought close, quote, as close as possible, end quote, to the question of how to live. So here's the actual quote from postscript. Instead of presenting the good in the form of actuality, as was ordinarily done, that this person and that person have actually lived, have actually done this, and thus transforming the reader into an observer, an admirer, an appraiser, it should be presented in the form of possibility. Then, whether or not the reader wants to exist in it is placed as close as possible to him. So the basic movement that Climacus describes here is a switch from external observer or admirer to one who's personally implicated in the possibilities opened up by the text. So what if Abraham's faith doesn't bear any resemblance to what I think of as faith? Is faith a possibility for me? Do I even want to exist in it? The passage from postscript continues. I have time? Yeah, okay. A production in the form of possibility places existing in as close places existing in it as close to the recipient as it is possible between as it is possible to be between one human being and another. The reader can understand the communication only by dissolving the essay of actuality into the posse, since otherwise he only imagines that he understands. apart from this, the fact that this person and that person actually have done this and that can just as well have a delaying as a motivating effect. The reader merely transforms the person who is being discussed into the rare exception. He admires him and says, "Oh, but I'm too insignificant to do anything like that," end quote. So everything about the way that Fear and Trembling is constructed cuts off this possibility of admiration or of holding oneself at a distance from the narrative. Since we see Abraham on the journey to Moriah, that's the space and the temporality of the novel, of the text. So Abraham's in the act of making himself, deciding in the moment what it is to live, and risking all. So the temporality of a text like Fear and Trembling contrasts with what Klimmek calls, quote, speculative absent-mindedness, end quote. And this is how he describes that state. Quote, instead of really being aware of himself as one who is living in the present and has the future before him, the speculative thinker mingles everything and wants to anticipate his own pastness in order then to act, end quote. So, and by the way, I'll just mention, have any of you seen the film Force Majeure? I think it's a really stunning example of exactly this kind of presentation, where the way in which the avalanche scene is done and the way in which the husband keeps wanting to call it a controlled explosion to sort of pretend as though nothing's happening. It's a film that I think follows this model of presentation in the form of possibility. So, Poetics of the Possible involves the active engagement of the reader on the level of imagination as well as critical judgment, weighing and assessing different perspectives, projecting oneself into the possibilities offered by the text. This offers a fictional space for actual self-transformation, both by providing models of such transformation and by the open-ended and anxiety-inducing nature of the texts themselves. So returning back to Klimek's desire to find a way of communicating existence that doesn't distort it by making it fit the structure of speculative thought. As much as existence is about temporal life, it's also for Kierkegaard about the possibility of entering into the fullness of time, in the moment. Abstraction or speculation, Kierkegaard suggests, offers a kind of false transcendence, achieving the eternal by removing the subject from time. Kierkegaard's Poetics of the Possible, by contrast, attempts to clear the way for a genuine opening or transcendence within the everyday. A sense of possibility, then, is perhaps most significant in the context of Kierkegaardian repetition, seeing anew what is there to be seen in the same, desiring what one has, a dialectical balance between the necessary of the actual and the possible. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jördis Becker-Lindenthal. I'm from the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, and I'm going to talk about how to cooperate with possibility, Kierkegaard on detachment, imagination, and hope. In The Sickness Unto Death, Anticlimacus stresses that believing that, quote, for God everything is possible at every moment is the antidote, the ultimate cure for despair. However, he also maintains that indulging in too much possibility leads to despair as well. Hence, it appears it all depends on how one relates to possibility, and that is in faith. In the following, I will consider three constituents of faithful engagement with possibility, which are detachment, a certain kind of imagination, and hope. I will begin with the description of various constellations of relating to possibility and the role imagination therein. I will distinguish between two kinds of possibility, profane and trivial, and divine possibility. So the first part of my talk presents three tableaus or three kaleidoscopic patterns of possibility and imagination in order to build up to my argument, which is Kierkegaard's account of Kierkegaard's account of detachment from trivial possibilities can best be described in the terminology of German vernacular mysticism, that is, as Entbildung. Entbildung literally means taking away images, cleansing the mind of images. So German Bild, of course, means image, and the Danish Bilde is pretty close to that. And so in the quotes I will try to illuminate the semantics of Bild operating in the background by giving the Danish terms as well. Entbildung counteracts Einbildung, in Danish Inbildning, which is the insertion or imprinting of images and the result of it. However, a purified Inbildningskraft, the power of imagination, operates with the assistance of grace, and as Anticlimacus shows in Practice in Christianity, it helps to actualize those possibilities that are essential for the human being, the ones linked to the imitation of Christ. So let us start with the first kaleidoscopic image, possibility and imagination in the sickness unto death. In his analysis of despair, Anticlimacus distinguishes between possibilities, despair, and necessities, despair, as we have already heard quite a lot about that. So the self has, or is, the continuous task of becoming itself, and, quote, in order to become itself, it reflects itself in the medium of imagination, Fantasiens medium. Like this, we can explore different ways to live our life, doing a different job, living in a different country or city, or on the countryside, going completely off the grid. But also on the small scale, with regard to daily interactions with other people, envisioning our potential self is essential, as David Gowans has shown, but with regard to what he calls the ethical imagination. But we need to invest an equal amount of energy in choosing and actualizing some of the options, because if we don't, we end up with a series of phantasmagoria, or phantasmagoria in Danish, which, quote, follow one another in such a rapid succession that it seems as if everything were possible. And this is exactly the final moment, the moment at which the individual himself becomes a mirage, at Luftsyn. We've already had that quote. What I find important here is the visual metaphors here at play. A wrong relation to possibility is characterized by an overwhelming abundances of images which turn themselves into a vague, illusionary appearance high up in the sky. Thus, Anticlimacus concludes, the mirror of possibility, Mulighed spejl, so another reference to the production of images, must be used with extreme caution. In contrast, necessity's despair is caused by denying possibility, or better, its prodigious elasticity. This despair comes in two forms, as a fatalistic or deterministic mentality and as a Philistine bourgeois mentality, Spitzbürgerlichkeit or Trivialität. The latter is said to be bereft of imagination, Fantasie. The Spitzbürger simply, quote, lives within a certain trivial compendium of expectations as to how things go, and as what usually happens. And he thinks that he controls possibility, leading, quote again, possibility around imprisoned in the case of probability, and imagining himself to be the master, Bilder sei in. So the imagination, in a way, is still active here. Since such control is a heuristic illusion that does not account for the fact that the self, like everything else, is has its source in God, this Spitzbürger fundamentally fails in becoming a self. Even though she does usually not suffer very much, she nevertheless is in deep despair. For the fatalist, every single aspect of life is predetermined and unchangeable. Denying possibility, one constituent of the self, she thus fails to become a self, thus lives in despair as well. In both cases, however, slumbering despair turns into suffering when something extraordinarily bad happens. Anticlimacus provides us with an example of someone whose worst nightmare becomes reality. Also here, the imagination plays an important role. Anticlimacus literally speaks of the horror that a terrified imagination has pictured for itself. And she stresses that, quote, at this point, salvation is, humanly speaking, utterly impossible. Let's describe it in different words. Assume that someone's partner or child suddenly dies, or maybe that a famous, passionate painter suddenly goes blind. For this person, then, it does not seem that anything could happen that would make life enjoyable again, except for a reunion with beloved or the return of her eyesight, which, humanly speaking, is impossible. Only the one who has faith does not collapse when such nightmare becomes true, and like Limerick says, because only the believer has, quote, the infallible antidote for despair, possibility, because for God everything is possible at every moment. So for the believer, as for the one who suffers of possibility's despair, possibility is total. We thus seem to be in a deadlock. In addition, we have identified different activities and outcomes of the imaginative activity. Imagination at the same time fosters and hampers through selfhood, creating possibilities ad infinitum, that is, suggesting that everything is possible. It drives into despair and turns the self into an abstract possibility. On the other hand, the imagination pulls the Spitzberger out of his or her despair of necessity, quote, in order for a person to become aware of himself and of God, imagination, Fantasien, must raise him higher from the miasm of probability. It must tear him out of this and teach him to hope and fear, or to fear and hope, by rendering possible that which surpasses the quantum satis, a sufficient standard of any experience. But isn't that the same as teaching him that everything is possible? Now you might want to say, but isn't the crucial difference the notion for God? Yes, it is. But what exactly does this entail? And how is the imagination to be understood in this regard? It appears to work only to a certain degree. I quote, the ingenuousness of the human imagination can extend to the point of creating possibility, but at last only this helps, that for God everything is possible. So, what happens to the imagination? Before we are going to address this question, I would like to shake the kaleidoscope again and present another constellation of possibility and imagination. The sickness unto death provides a detailed system of various forms of despair. But when it comes to sort of how Anticlimacus sees his contemporaries, it appears that they mostly suffer of the Spitzberger's despair. They suffocate in the trivialization of possibility without even noticing it. So this becomes evident in a journal entry from 1849, so the same year in which The Sickness Unto Death was published. Reflecting on his two ethical religious discourses, Kierkegaard writes that, quote, Christianity or the gospel has become trivial, because people have known it for so long already, having learnt it by rote. Thus, he continues, it now depends on making the life of Christ present, and he hopes to achieve this with the two discourses, quote again, with the help of a human analogy, and poetically, possibility is provided instead of facticity. And possibility is precisely that which awakens. So here we have a positive account of poetically creating possibility for someone else. Dictates poetically, Kierkegaard intends to, quote, give a more vivid or fresher impression, Indruck, of the gospel. Via images, the reader's imagination is to be affected in a certain way, that is, in a way that makes her perceive her possibility, and we can add only a specific kind of possibility. Because it is not the abundance of possible options of how to live a life, and also not the calculating diminishment of possibility as probability that is awakening. Rather, it is a kind of divine possibility. The two ethical religious discourses deal with the questions whether a human being has the right to let himself be put to death for the truth, and what the difference might be between a genius and an apostle. And I'm mainly interested in the first one because there Kierkegaard lets the pseudonym HH evoke the most extreme existential possibility, which is imitating Christ up to his death. So the introduction of this discourse presents us with a man who as a child received a very strong impression, Indruck, of Jesus Christ as the crucified. I quote, "This picture, Bilde, followed him throughout his life. He never lost sight of this picture." So note that the picture is a mental picture, something that the imagination presents to him. And as the child gets older, the picture starts to exert a strong pull. Quote, "It seems to him as if it continually required something of him. Via this image, then, the imagination pushes the man towards the extreme possibility of trying for the truth." But the man lived on quietly. He attended only to himself and God, and this picture, H.A. says, still what constituted his life was his willingness, the almost irresistible urge to become like the image of the crucified. But at some point the man started to doubt whether one actually has the right to be put to death for the truth. From then on, he did only one thing: he pondered this thought early and late. His many thoughts are the content of the discourse. This is how H.A. finishes the introduction. I do not want to dwell on these thoughts themselves, though I'd like to stress the outcome. It is the greatest hypocrisy, H.H. writes, quote, "to think that one possesses the truth in such a way that one is put to death for the truth, that one lets others become guilty of putting one death for the truth. It is even worse than to think one has the truth and then to want to put another human being to death in order to compel him to accept the truth." As a consequence, the man we met in the introduction would have to let go of his determination, of the wish to turn the most extreme possibility of his life into actuality. He needs to realize that the question is not whether one is allowed to die for the truth. Rather, the question is, am I in possession of the truth? And the answer is categorically no. Thus, a man not only has to give up his attempt to understand the life and death of the God-man. In some section, he prays that God will give him the spiritual power to crush, quote, "all the conceitedness," or in Danish, indbilskhed, that presumably wants to comprehend. He also has to give up his will. In other words, he has to detach himself from his particular ideas of how to understand and how to react or act in relation to the picture the imagination has presented to him. This process of cleansing the faculties of intellect and the will has been described in German vernacular mysticism as Entbildung. That it can be applied as a fruitful heuristic for Kierkegaard's writing becomes evident in the third part of Practicing Christianity. Let us thus turn to the last kaleidoscopic image. In the first part of Practicing Christianity, Anticlimacus imagines the reactions of his contemporaries if Jesus Christ suddenly were to walk among them in the streets of Copenhagen. They react like the Spitzbergers described in The Sickness Unto Death would react, applying their, quote again, trivial compendium of expectations as how do things go, what usually happens, and then they deem the incarnation of God to be rather unlikely or improbably, especially in such a human being. For instance, a solid citizen would argue that Jesus simply cannot be God because he surrounds himself with street loafers and tramps. Also, the clergyman would assert that, quote, "the expected one will look entirely different, will come as the most glorious flowering. Moreover," I quote again, "he will recognize the established order as the authority, will summon all the clergy to a convention, and then, if in balloting he has the majority, he will be accepted and hailed as the extraordinary that he is the expected one." These Spitzbergers are united by the lack of receptivity for divine possibility, the most extreme being the incarnation. The imagination is blocked by social norms, by a set of culturally imagery which has replaced the God-man, an incomprehensible sign of contradiction, with an intellectually digestible fantasy picture of Christ, et fantastis Christus. As a result, they are unable to receive the image of Christ as prototype, or Danish forbilde, literally an image that stands in front of us. In the three parts of Practicing Christianity, Anticlimacus exposes us to different aspects of the God-man that have been pushed aside in Christendom's imagery. He is an inviter who in his earthly power poverty promises help for all those who are burdened, Matthew 11:28. He's a sign of contradiction and an offense, Matthew 11:6. And he who was mocked and tortured wants us to follow him in his abasement, John 12:32. It is the latter image that Anticlimacus repeatedly and most intensely paints with his words when he urges us to give us our image of Christ in his loftiness. Quote, "Would that the image, builder of you, in your abasement might stand before us so vividly, so awakening and persuasive, that we will feel ourselves drawn to you in lowliness, drawn to want to be like you in lowliness." So note that he prays to have a certain forestilling, that his imagination would work in a specific way. The third part of Practice in Christianity pretty much is an elaboration of what is said about the man in the ethical religious discourse. Anticlimacus gives us a detailed account of the development of someone who as a child was shown a picture of the crucified and who as a consequence experiences what Joachim Garf has called a Bildernisse, that is a Bildung or education that takes its etymology seriously and happens via images. We also get a step-by-step description of what happens when the child has become an adolescent who wants to resemble that image. While the child has sworn to take revenge for Christ, the adolescent only wishes one thing, and that is to suffer approximately as he suffered in his world. But the young man is under the influence of an idealized image, which he installs as his inspiration, as his, quote, more perfect, more ideal self. The imagination presents him with a beautified version of the most extreme existential possibility. However, this causes some problems for, quote, "It looks very easy the way the imagination in building depicts the image builder. One sees only the perfection, sees even the struggling perfection only as finished or as accomplished." So imitating Christ in the real world turns out to be much more difficult and much less glorious than imagined. But the image holds the adolescent in a firm grip, and so the transformation must continue. Quote, "He cannot persuade himself to abandon the image, he cannot escape his suffering either." But the young man now at least realizes, quote, what his love will cost him, but who knows, he says, after all, better times will come. Help will certainly come, and it can still turn out all right. Again, this is the wrong understanding of what it means to follow Christ. Selfless works of love and suffering are not rewarded, and it is an illusion to assume one would be able to follow Christ in his loftiness. This experience intensifies the young man's suffering. However, while he remains unable to give up the image of the suffering Christ as such, he gives up his all too convenient interpretations of it and lets go of all self-indulgence expectations of this extreme existential possibility, all hubristic calculations and specific hopes for the intervention of God. Slowly he adapts the image to actuality and thus comes to imitate Christ as much as a human being is able to. So note that this does not include being put to death for the truth. So Anticlimacus is rather vague with regard to what following Christ means, and we will hear more about this tomorrow when Francis gives her talk, I guess. So what is striking, or is it on Saturday, right? Sorry. We will hear more about it on Saturday. So what is striking in the Practice in Christianity's case of the young man is the intervention of God, which is, as I said, totally different to what the young man has actually imagined. Anticlimacus describes a caring governance who, quote, never tries the person beyond his ability, but instead introduces the youth to an only gradually increasing intensity of suffering. Quote, this is how governance deals with him many times, and every time helps him further and further out into suffering. If he had immediately been confronted with the essential suffering that he must endure to become a follower of Christ, he would not have succeeded. I quote again, if existence had done this at the outset, it would have crushed him. Now he is probably able to bear it. Yes, he must be able to. It's since governance does it with him, governance who indeed is love. Let us now finally turn to German vernacular mysticism. The role of German vernacular mysticism for Kierkegaard's thought still is a research dissertation. I do not have time to delve into all the details here, but what I would like to stress is that there are strong reasons to assume that Kierkegaard actually was inspired by German mysticism, and in particular by the Dominican friar Johannes Tauler, who lived in the 14th century. Kierkegaard, for instance, owned all 3 volumes of Tauler's sermons, and one of these sermons is an exposition of the same biblical verse which the third part of Practice in Christianity explores, that is John 12:32, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." In fact, as I argue elsewhere, the third part of Practice in Christianity seems to be not only an exposition of John 12:32, but also of Tauler's sermon, which is the second sermon on the exaltation of the cross, by the way. So there are astonishing similarities between both texts. Like Anticlimacus, Tauler describes how the minds of his contemporaries are cluttered with trivial images or impressions. So in German it is Einbildung or kreatürliche Bilder. So this is a medieval German. If you are learning German and find it sounds strange, don't worry. These Einbildungen are about what is supposed to be important in life, which is status and material wealth, and what being Christian means. And these images keep Tauler's contemporaries, this is what Tauler says, from becoming what they really are supposed to be, followers of Christ. So Tauler literally says to follow the image of Christ, to Bilden nachfolgen, and he also calls Jesus a Vorbild, which is pretty close to Vorbilder. So, and in this sermon, Tauler also criticized indulging in the beautified idea of resembling Christ, pretty much like the young man did in Practice in Christianity. Therefore, Tauler advises his listeners to be sober, and he reminds them, quote, to find the cross in trials and temptations rather than in the full bloom of sentimental emotion. Tauler then gives a detailed account of what really needs to happen in order to be drawn to Christ, a thorough cleansing or Entbildung from all the creaturely images. It might be interesting to note here that the first part of the sermon focuses on the mental images we hold, thus on the intellect, while the second part concentrates on the will, which also needs to be annihilated. Quote, give yourself up to the Lord and die to your own self completely, which means die utterly to your will. The theoretically background for this practical advice, of course, is constituted by Tauler's teacher, Meister Eckhart, who in the book of Divine Consolation says, quote, a true wholehearted man has to die to himself to get rid of his self in God, sein selbes entbildet, and become reshaped, überbildet in God's will. This is exactly what happens in the case of the young man in Practicing Christianity, and it is also suggested as adequate for the unnamed man in the ethical religious discourse. Because what both need to realize is that imitating Christ means first and foremost letting go of their attempts to understand and even to negotiate with God. When the young man finally learns to surrender, he experiences that indeed, for God, everything is possible. After all, God helped him with his goal to imitate Christ. But it is totally different from what he thought this meant. Only after a long process, he thus finally comes to resemble Jesus Christ, who according to Mark 14:36 prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father, everything is possible for you, take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. So let me now wrap up and put the kaleidoscopic images together. In the tableaus I have presented over the last 30 minutes or so, imagination and possibility are linked in many ways. Imagination is essential for selfhood as it presents the self with possible ways to act, communicate and think. However, imagination can also make the self go astray in possibility as such, if everything is regarded as possible. In such a case, the self is turned into an empty illusion, a Luftzug. Furthermore, imagination can liberate the self from the bourgeois, trivial mentality which produces smug images of self-control by breaking possibility down into probabilities. Imagination can also cause fear and trembling when it makes the self envision her worst nightmare as a possible reality. And as we have seen, Anticlimacus judges most of his contemporaries to be in despair. The imagination is only adequately contributing to authentic selfhood there. What it lacks is a frame, and that is faith, in short, the belief that everything is possible for God. This, however, does not mean something like, rest assured, God will take care of this or that. It is not the same as handing over to God the fulfillment of specific wishes and hopes regarding something that is impossible from a human perspective. This becomes evident in the case of the two men who, in their attempt to imitate Christ, had very concrete of how God would help them. Finally, in addressing the ultimate existential possibility of the imitatio Christi, Anticlimacus maintains that imagination experiences cooperative grace. God, or governance, presents opportunities to the aspiring Christian to cleanse the mind from convenient, smug, and socially constructed images we hold of the world, others, us, and God. According to Anticlimacus, God administers the adequate dosages for such a processual existential kenosis. As a result, a purified imagination, a purified Inbildungskraft, is able to perceive the divine possibility as one boundlessly rich yet abstract possibility. It is the possibility of a divine that, not a big rag bag crammed with trivial possibilities of what's and how's. The believer embraces the dizzying thought that God, in his almighty power, is able to do everything at every moment, including things we cannot even imagine. This is thus the reversal of the overwhelming abundance of possibility presented by the imagination in the case of despair. And after the Endbildung, the imagination can reapproach the many possibilities of what's and how's and help the individual choose and actualize some of them, assessing them with a clear goal in mind, which is to become a follower of Christ. Only then can despair be overturned, only then can the self rest transparently in the power that establishes it. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's just leave it. So, last talk of the day, so only one to go and then you get to get a drink, which is always a good place to be. I just wanted to say a little bit about the context of this talk. So my title was Beyond Possibility, Expectancy and Substantial Hope in the Task of Forgiveness. And the context of the talk is, I'm trying to write a book on forgiveness at the moment, where Kierkegaard is a crucial figure in the background, but it isn't on Kierkegaard directly. And this talk is pretty much in that kind of mold. In other words, is Kierkegaard-inspired questions, Kierkegaardian kind of ideas, but it isn't Kierkegaard exegesis in the way that some of the other talks have been. So the questions in the background here are this idea that came up particularly in Eben's talk about possibility as hope, or hope as possibility. I'm interested in the question about, well, how does hope work? And how might hope be a work of love, particularly in the context of interpersonal forgiveness? The second thing to say by way of preliminary is that I once heard Alistair MacIntyre say that he had reached the age where he had to choose between being able to see his audience and being able to see his paper. And I've reached that point at an earlier age than MacIntyre did. So I hope you will forgive me for making the same choice that he did. So as we now know, given earlier papers, even if we didn't know this before, Kierkegaard's comments on possibility are decidedly mixed. In Fear and Trembling, for instance, Johannes is dismissive of fools and young people who mistakenly chatter about everything being possible for a human being, while the attitude that says one can't know what will happen, it might still be possible, he labels paltry hope, a mere caricature of faith. Paltry hope sounds like that variety of hope which is given equally short shrift at the start of repetition, which is associated with youthfulness, cowardice, superficiality, and described as a beckoning fruit that does not satisfy. The fools and young people who unquestioningly put their trust in possibility are an echo of the naive hopers referred to in the earlier discourse, the expectancy of faith, more of which shortly. And yet, in Works of Love, Kierkegaard contrasts one aspect of possibility with what he calls the tough slime of practical sagacity or shrewdness. Possibility, he says, is this marvellous thing that is so infinitely frail, and yet brought into being and shaped with the help of the eternal, is stronger than anything else, if it is the possibility of good. So it's the good, as we've already heard, that makes the difference. But relating oneself in expectancy to the possibility of the good has already been given as a definition of hope, conceived of as a formed disposition of the person of faith. What Kierkegaard is talking about here then is not a one-off instance of hoping, even the paltry hoper can manage that, but hopefulness as a disposition. So we need to make a distinction between mere possibility, paltry hope, and the tendencies of the naive hoper on the one hand, and that kind of formed disposition that Kierkegaard labels expectancy of the good on the other. In what follows, I'll argue that helpful light is shed on such a distinction by a comparison with what Philip Pettit has called superficial as opposed to substantial hope. And I want to claim that such a comparison shows how hope, qua expectancy of the good, operates on a practical level. That's my claim. So in most recent philosophical writing on hope, the default conception of it is as a desired possibility which is neither impossible nor certain. In other words, where the probability of the desired end is somewhere between 0 and 1, but neither 0 nor 1. There's nothing in that conception, notice, that distinguishes hope from the paltry version. Contrast that with Margaret Urban Walker's thought that in order to count as hoping for an outcome, one has to invest some of one's agency in it. This is illustrated in the film The Shawshank Redemption, a much-cited example in recent philosophical writing on hope. The wrongly imprisoned Andy, the spokesman for hope, has set up a way to access his money and get to Mexico if he's able to escape from jail, but his friend Red, Morgan Freeman, who considers hope to be dangerous, has made no such plans. So some sense of agency with respect to the object of hope seems to be what Kierkegaard is getting at in talking about relating oneself in expectancy to the possibility of good. Hope, Kierkegaard insists, always pertains to a task for one who has the good as their object. And here you're supposed to be able to see the second slide, but that didn't really work. In The Expectancy of Faith, Kierkegaard claims that we dare to be occupied with the future only when we have conquered it. This is glossed as actively expecting victory, a likely reference to Romans 8:28, sometimes rendered as, in all things God works for the good of those who love him. I submit that the expectancy of faith sounds like a particular version of what Pettit labels cognitive resolve. Granted, Pettit's non-theistic account lacks the reliance on God or the eternal that is central to Kierkegaard's account. But I still think that Pettit's cognitive resolve helps to illustrate what Kierkegaard's claim amounts to in practical terms. And here's why. Intuitively, I think, we might understand expectancy in two different ways. One is essentially predictive. To expect something is to anticipate that it will happen. On such a view, to approach expectancy in terms of probability, asking what are the chances, is a fair question for practical reason to ask. This sounds like the approach of the figure Kierkegaard labels the man of experience, who sees himself as a rational adjudicator between the excessive claims of the overly optimistic, the naive hope of youth, and the overly pessimistic, the troubled person who brings her past disappointments into each new situation. And he does this armed with his all-purpose tool, the phrase, to an extent, or to a certain degree. But that's not what Kierkegaard has in mind. In proposing that the practical role played by Kierkegaardian expectancy can be understood by considering how Petit's substantial hope as cognitive resolve operates, we need to consider two related dimensions of the latter. Substantial hope, claims Petit, is a way of retaining our identity in the face of uncertainty. That's one. And two, it offers the best way of coping with finding our way through harsh realities. So let's try to unpack those thoughts. Petit's account of substantial hope draws an analogy with precaution. Just as Kierkegaard contrasts fear and hope as different manifestations of expectancy, so Petit considers precaution as a reaction to a feared, undesirable outcome, and substantial hope as a reaction to a desired outcome. Suppose I have an intense aversion for a possible outcome. Petit's example is a serious cost overrun on a building project. To avoid this danger, and the danger of my own action leaving me unprotected against it, I adopt the strategy of acting as if it will occur, or as if there's a good chance that it will occur, as the best available method of protection. So I set aside additional funds as a kind of insurance policy. Substantial hope for a desired possibility works by analogy to this. It amounts to acting as if there is a reason to be moved to act, as if the desired prospect will obtain, or as if there are a good chance that it will obtain. So how might that be rationally defensible? Well, precaution makes sense if the level of confidence I have for the feared prospects materialising is too low to guard against the danger of being unprotected. Even if our house is extremely unlikely to burn down, it still makes sense to insure against that prospect. The parallel for hope is this. If the level of confidence that the agent has for the desired prospect is too low to guard against another kind of danger, namely that the agent loses heart and ceases to exercise agency effectively. If the desired prospect is assigned a low probability, this might cause me to give up. What's the point, I ask myself? Despair in the most everyday sense. But such loss of heart can lead us to give up on prospects that are within our influence. An example I suspect familiar to many an experienced teacher is the student who drops out of university in the face of one disappointing set of grades. It might thus be that I have to hope if I'm able to keep going. This gives us one reason why hope may often be pragmatically rational. So I'm touching here on the question that I asked of Eben earlier on. Such hope helps lift us out of the panics and depressions to which we're naturally prey, and to give us firm direction and control. Without hope, we are not capable of asserting our agency and of putting our own signature or stamp on our conduct. Faced with the possibility of collapsing in a heap of despair and uncertainty, hope in this scenario can be our one salvation as agents, our only way of remaining capable of seeing ourselves in what we do. In many circumstances, hope represents the only way of retaining our identity and selfhood, and of not losing ourselves in the turmoil of what Petit calls brute, disheartening fact. The second and related reason is that hope may offer us the best way of coping with those harsh realities and of finding our way through them. A commonly cited example here concerns hope in the face of illness. There's a weight of empirical evidence which suggests that hope helps people cope better with such diagnoses. And more broadly, in facing bad news, the hopeful often succeed in overcoming obstacles that might otherwise have brought them down. Now, people get rightly suspicious about some of the more outlandish claims made in this sort of context. Apparently, if we Brits only believe in Brexit, it's all going to turn out fine. But Petit claims that there need be no magic involved here. On his account, to hope involves investing the scenario with a level of confidence that may exceed the confidence of my actual belief in the prospect. An attitude of hope redirects attention, desire, and imaginative planning to possibilities that are more fact-processing, probability-assessing, evidence-seeking mentality, what Kierkegaard calls sagacity or shrewdness, Kloska, would likely reject. But this should not thereby be dismissed as irrational, wishful thinking. Petit puts this rather nicely when he says, I quote, "Forming the hope that a particular scenario will eventuate, or at least eventuate in the event of your taking a certain initiative, is a way of handling the hurly-burly of belief. It frees you from the bleakness of beliefs that wax and wane unpredictably in level of confidence. To have hope is to have something that we might describe as cognitive resolve. Such cognitive resolve and the attitudes and actions it inspires distinguishes this hope, I think, from idle wishing, wishful thinking, and paltry hope. And that, I submit, is how hope as expectancy might function on a practical level. So one obvious possible objection is that Kierkegaard's expectancy, Petit's substantial hope, or both, involves self-deception. Surely, goes the objection, if I'm to be reasonable, I should proportion my hope to the evidence. Now, I find Petit's response to this especially interesting. He argues that rationality does not always support such detached processing of fact in the cases where hope is relevant. Such an assumption reckons without the kind of creatures that we are, not mere probability calculating machines, but creatures subject to being swamped by feelings of anxiety, desolation, failures of confidence, and so on, which can radically undermine our capacity for agency. Crucially, substantial hope need not involve any illusion as to how things actually are. When the hopeful person acts as if they were more firmly established than the evidence shows, this can be done quite honestly and openly. They're being willing to admit to themselves and to others that for very good pragmatic reasons, they're refusing to expose themselves to the low or unstable tide of evidence. For current practical purposes, they are investing their confidence in a firmer, more encouraging prospect. So allow me a personal example, and I'm going to try and do this without bursting into tears, for a reason you might see in a minute. My father died earlier this year. In the face of a terminal cancer diagnosis last year, which gave him up to 3 years to live, Dad sometime thereafter got the news that one key part of this treatment had ceased to be effective, which reduced the prognosis to 12 months. This meant that my dad was already living on borrowed time. One evening over a pub meal with his loyal friend Eddie, they started discussing plans to take the ferry over to Ireland for a holiday, two old widowers together. This conversation, probably a month or so before Dad's eventual death, looks from one angle absurd. Even at the time, many would have dismissed it as wishful thinking. But I think that Petit enables us to see it as something else. The prospect of this kind of possibility was a hope that kept my dad going, which a detached weighing of the probabilities would have snuffed out. I don't believe my dad ever believed that this trip was likely, but it was possible. And in entertaining it, in discussing it seriously as a potential future project, he chose to view it after the fashion of Petit's hope as cognitive resolve, investing in a firmer, more encouraging prospect. Now, it's true that hope, as I'm describing it here, displays some facets reminiscent of self-deception. If I set out to act on a certain hope, for example, I may tell you that I don't want you to take me through this or that litany of evidence and fact. However, and this is the key point, I may recognise that this is so, and in refusing to listen to the full recital of presumptive evidence, I do not tell myself a lie. I can be utterly undeceived about what I'm doing. That, I believe, is what my dad was doing, and I concur with Petit that far from being dismissed as self-deception, such hope can be a pragmatically rational attitude to take. And I would add that insofar as it enables one to go on, it may even be a work of proper self-love. So my claim has been that on a practical level, hope as cognitive resolve is more or less how Kierkegaardian expectancy might work. It's not, at least not necessarily, that I force myself to believe against the evidence, but that I adopt a hope for a desired prospect that is able to keep me going, even in the face of doubt, in the face of the waxing and waning of the strength of my belief. So the question for my own wider project is how this might play out in the context of interpersonal forgiveness. So again, just to repeat what I said earlier, the idea is Kierkegaard is in the background here, and I'm trying to make sense of the question of what interpersonal forgiveness might look like as a work of love in something like the Kierkegaardian sense, and what the relation of hope might be in that kind of background. But I'm trying to take that centrally Kierkegaardian set of questions beyond just Kierkegaard's own texts. So in the book on forgiveness on which I'm currently working, I've drawn on two particularly rich memoirs of interpersonal forgiveness. One is the Icelandic playwright Thordis Elver's extraordinary book South of Forgiveness, about the struggle of a victim of date rape over many years to forgive her rapist. The other is an instance of third-party forgiveness, which I argue in the book can be a legitimate form of forgiveness. That expressed by Sister Helen Prejean in her attitude towards the convicted death row inmate Pat Sonnier in her compelling memoir Dead Man Walking. Both memoirs illustrate that the hope involved in forgiveness is at least twofold. Hope as oriented towards others, for instance, hope for the wrongdoer's willingness to repent and their ability to reform, and hope as oriented towards oneself, chiefly one's ability to begin and continue on the path of forgiveness. Though, of course, Kierkegaard will give us reasons for thinking that those two dimensions are both inextricably linked. Both memoirs illustrate the importance of hope as requiring an investment of one's agency, as opposed to just idly wishing. Again, the distinction that Eben was bringing up earlier. Thordis corresponds by email for years with Tom Stranger, the Australian who raped her when they were both teenage students, each of them eventually flying halfway across the world to South Africa for the week-long meeting that gives the memoir its focus. Prejean devotes her life to the fate of death row inmates, the battle for the lives and souls of those to whom she offers spiritual counsel, becoming all-consuming. So I believe that the hope that such forgiveness manifests can be said to be a work of love. Love, Kierkegaard claims, takes upon itself hope, hoping for others as a work, as a task, agency. How so? Prejean's attitude to Sonia in Thordis' towards Tom and her initially angry and damaged self is, I suggest, an illustration of what Adrian Martin has called normative hope. And this, I think, is highly relevant to what Kierkegaard is up to when he talks about hope in works of love. In other words, an aspiration that we hold on behalf of ourselves, or a good that we hold out for another person in the hope that they will aspire to it. The idea here is that in some versions of hoping for others, part of the point of addressing others with hope is that the recipients might take up the values or principles deemed worthwhile and aspired for on their behalf, such that hope can scaffold their normative change. It's this that Dead Man Walking shows as succeeding in the Sonnier case. Some writers on forgiveness have seen resentment towards another as a call and response kind of reactive attitude, an address to another that we are holding them to account. Such normative hope is also a call and response attitude, one that issues a challenge, sometimes indirectly, that the wrongdoer should take responsibility for their actions, repent, and attempt to reform. Normative hope is an aspiring attitude with regard to worthwhile ends that we set for ourselves or others. Hope's attitude towards possibility, that possibilities are open, is a prospect that can galvanize energy, stabilize focus, and fortify resolve. And I've argued elsewhere that I think this can be a work of love if it's underpinned by what Nicholas Wolterstorff has labelled care agapism, in which agapic love for the wrongdoer is not just a justice-ignoring benevolence, but a form of aspiration-setting love that has a concern for justice built into it. In both the expectancy of faith and works of love, Kierkegaard insists that genuine hope cannot be disappointed. Now, what does that amount to in forgiveness? It's never giving up on the one for whom you hope. Prejean for Sonnier, Thordis for both Tom, and in battling her own demons, herself. Kierkegaard urges his reader to hope all things, give up on no human being, such that to give up on him is to give up on your love for him. And such love allows one to hope in a way that sagacity or shrewdness cannot. So in the time left to me, let me address two possible objections, both of which have Kierkegaard more squarely in mind, I think. The first is what we might call the something particular objection. In the expectancy of faith, Kierkegaard is critical of hope that is for something particular. The person who expects something particular, he says, can be deceived in his expectancy, but this does not happen to the person of faith. Now, I see that not as the embrace of what David Kangas has labelled the absolute future, as opposed to the future as represented. Applied to the context of forgiveness, that would come uncomfortably close to the embrace of any eventuality, which would be to fail to acknowledge the wrongness of the action and the legitimacy of negative reactive attitudes towards it, which risks failing to distinguish forgiving from condoning or excusing, which is a big distinction in the philosophical literature on forgiveness. And there's at least one way in which this hoped-for future must be represented if it is to count as an instance of hope at all for Kierkegaard, namely, represented as good, as we've already heard on more than one occasion today. So what I want to suggest is something slightly different. It's rather that we should not seek to specify too determinately in advance what form that good will take. Rather than being an unconditional acceptance of the future qua future, I think that what is being commended here is the acceptance of the future as a manifestation of the good, even if we lack the capacity to understand how the good will be manifested. Now that brings us into the territory of Jonathan Lear's Kierkegaard-inspired notion of radical hope, so named because, in Lear's words, it is directed towards a future goodness that transcends the current ability to understand what it is. And I've argued elsewhere, as at least one person in the room knows, that radical hope sheds illuminating light on the fear and trembling conception of faith. Hello, Jeff, we've discussed this in the past. Lear's primary example of radical hope is the case of Plenty Coups, the last great chief of the Crow nation, facing up to the collapse of his culture and the concepts that had given that culture its meaning, and wondering for what he might hope in the face of such cultural devastation. But I want to suggest that radical hope also has a place in some circumstances where the devastation is not so much of a culture and its concepts, as where a life where the furniture of one's universe is radically disrupted by a cataclysmic event. And Tordis's rape is one such example. Her memoir makes clear the profound psychological consequences of her ordeal, a multi-year history of eating disorders, alcohol, and self-harm, along with ill-judged relationship choices, some of which led to further instances of rape, if we read between the lines of the memoir. Central to Tordis's problems was her inability for years to trust, having had that trust so cruelly betrayed. And my suggestion is that such an experience can take one to what Lear calls the limits of one's understanding, in a different sense from the collapse of one's culture. So my question here is as follows. Is what the forgiving person substantially hopes for something particular in the sense to which Kierkegaard objects in the expectancy of faith discourse? If so, then there's a clear disanalogy with both Kierkegaardian expectancy and radical hope. Or can what is substantially hoped for be sufficiently indeterminate to avoid this worry? And here's my proposal. My proposal is that many instances of hope in interpersonal forgiveness do avoid this objection, and that this helps us to see such hope in a different light from the way in which it's typically portrayed. At first glance, Préjean's and Tordis's hope, whether explicitly articulated or not, that Saunier or Tom would repent and reform sounds like something particular, but not so fast. Consider Tordis's shifting sense both of what she wants from Tom and of the significance of her rape. Her view of what the hoped-for manifestation of the good looks like changes radically over the course of the memoir. Her initial sense of a desire for revenge, wanting to see Tom humiliated, morphs into a desire for him to apologise and atone, his apology stemming from a genuine recognition of the real significance of what he has done to her and the effect it's had on her life. But it doesn't stop there. As their week in South Africa progresses and she learns more of worldwide attitudes to rape through the impressive victim support centre that they both visit, she sees her rape in a significantly different light, developing a sense of gratitude that she at least lives in a society that takes rape seriously, that views it as something extraordinary rather than mundane, and that recognises victims as deserving of sympathy and support rather than shame and ostracism. She also learns more of that terrible incident's effects on Tom, the guilt that Tom has come to feel as the realisation of the horror of what he has done has significantly damaged his own life. And whereas once the news of his suffering would have been precisely what Tordis wanted, the shift towards the end of the memoir is of them both wanting to work to get something good to come out of this terrible ordeal, their joint book and its consciousness raising about rape and its after effects being an attempt in this direction, albeit an extremely controversial one. So my point here is not to defend any particular position on the spectrum of Tortoise's shifting attitudes. It's simply to note that the content of an attitude of hope in a multi-year experience of trying to reach forgiveness cannot be nailed down in advance with even the slightest degree of precision. In other words, it's by no stretch of the imagination something particular in the sense that Kierkegaard objects to. The most precise we can be of Thordis, once she has got beyond her thirst for revenge, is that she wants Tom to repent and atone, whatever that would come to mean, and for some good to come out of her ordeal, whatever that would come to mean. And people who know the Lear book will recognise in that kind of terminology the way that the way that Lear talks about plenty coup. Moreover, in some instances of forgiveness, the open-endedness of this hope is far more explicit right from the start. Marina Catacancino's exhibition and subsequent book, The Forgiveness Project, includes one example that illustrates this particularly well. Katie Hutchinson's husband Bob was beaten to death while checking on a rowdy party being thrown by his next-door neighbour's son. In the small Canadian town in which they lived, a wall of silence grew up around the murder, and it was 4 years before Ryan Aldridge admitted to having been responsible for the fatal blow. What is striking about Katie's near immediate reaction in telling her two small children that fateful night what had happened to their father, is her observation that, and I quote, "I promised them and I promised myself that underneath the horror of what had just happened, we would find a gift. In this we will find a gift." That, I submit, is a statement of radical hope, a kind of expectancy, in the context of a situation of serious wrongdoing and subsequent forgiveness. In its non-specificity, it illustrates Lear's claim of how the goodness of the world transcends our finite powers to grasp it. And the second and final objection that I want to try and address is that my use of Petit's non-theistic account of hope in terms of cognitive resolve is prevented from being a helpful illustration of Kierkegaardian hope or anything like it, because it doesn't take into account Kierkegaard's distinction between mundane, earthly, and temporal hope on the one hand, and authentic, eschatological, or eternal hope on the other. Doesn't Petit's substantial hope fall on the earthly or temporal side of that divide? Now, I've no wish to deny that for Kierkegaard there is, of course, a specifically Christian hope, and that this is what matters most, but we shouldn't be too hasty to dismiss all hope that is not specifically Christian as worthless. And I think that Kierkegaard ultimately agrees with this himself, despite some of the other things that he says. In a longer version of the paper, I can detail more textually what my reasons for that latter claim. But my response to this second objection depends, in part, on my answer to the first. Such hope as I'm commending here is not something particular in the sense to which Kierkegaard objects. So let's unpack this in stages. The object of earthly hope is said to be something that is realizable in the temporal world, but that can easily be lost. Like temporality itself, it cannot be thought of as permanent. In Works of Love, Kierkegaard glosses the object of such hope as follows: a wish, a longing expectation, now of one thing, now of another. In short, an expectant person's relationship to the possibility of multiplicity. But this kind of fickle wish, now one thing, now another, is a long way removed from "in this we will find a gift." The latter is not lost in multiplicity in the way described here. The question is whether there is, in the kind of hope I see in Katie Hutchinson, as well as in Prejean, who of course is a Catholic nun, has explicitly Christian commitments, whether there is in Katie's position an element of the eternal, which Kierkegaard takes to be the object of eschatological hope. And my answer to that, I think, is yes. So here I'm following John Davenport in taking eschatological in its broadest sense to be about the vindication of the good by divine authority, so roughly victory as glossed in the expectancy of faith discourse. The target of such eschatological hope is the good as such, not reducible to any particular temporal end. And when Kierkegaard says that the whole of one's life should be the time of hope, it's such hope as that he has in mind. But in a key Works of Love passage in which he seeks to distinguish true or authentic hope from what passes for it in ordinary speech, he says this: as soon as the choice, to hope, is made, the possible is changed, because the possibility of the good is the eternal. By the decision to hope, to choose hope, one decides infinitely more than it seems, because it is an eternal decision. So I think that what makes that more than just a pro-attitude towards an abstraction, the good, is that, as Marc Bernier has put it, the possibility of the good is a second-order possibility that we relate to only through other possibilities. The possibilities inherent in the specific challenges of our lives. In this sense, authentic hope involves a synthesis between the temporal and the eternal. Hope's task in the form of eternity, Kierkegaard claims, is to hope all things, and in the form of temporality, to hope always. But Katie Hutchinson's "In this we will find a gift" seems to be an expression of such a hope. To hope all things in the sense that nobody, even her husband's killer, is beyond the scope of her hope, and to hope always. The latter does not mean a conscious choice made every second of every day, but rather that one must regularly renew one's commitment to hope, renewing the expectation for the possibility of the good, to never give in to despair, to always remain open to the good. This is the sense in which our whole lives are to be the time of hope. Such hoping, Kierkegaard insists, must be done in love. We cannot expect the good unless we love. To lovingly hope for others is to remain open to the possibility of the good in their lives, never to despair over them. And I want to suggest that it's this that we see in Préjean's attitude towards the death ray inmates, and it is this that we see in this we will find a gift. And since we have the reception coming up shortly, I can think of worse things to drink to than that.